suspect. Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge and Extortion.
Get Bond. Ted.
What's going on, everybody? We're back and excited for this episode of How to Bond. We're going to be talking to a great buddy of mine, somebody who you guys know and love throughout the Bond community. We're going to be talking about how to villain. Well, more so how to pick a Bond villain or how to understand the Bond villain or why is it even important to have a Bond villain and, what makes them memorable. So, David, how's it going? I know it's been a minute. I know you're in the process of moving, right?
I am. It's been a little busy. Both of us have moved in the last
Yes.
month or whatever it might be. So we've been it's been a little busy. I'm kind of revisiting like, oh, I have these items. Some of them are Bond items. Where I'm like, I haven't even seen those items for a little while.
You never
So,
know how much you really have until you're moving. That's
but it's
what
exciting. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So-
And excited for our guest today and to kind of veer on a little different version of the How to Bond series here that we have on those Bond Guys podcast. And yeah, this is gonna be exciting.
Yeah. So with no further ado, Chris, how's it going, brother? The Bond Report on Instagram and YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
Sweet. All right. Well, we're gonna just essentially have just a conversation about Bond villains, just Bond villains in general. I know you have done so many interesting things about Bond villains because that's right up your alley because that's essentially what your channel is themed and about. Do you mind giving the listeners a little bit of a backstory on why you decided to go the villain route?
Yeah. So, I started doing the Bond Report. God, it's been over 2 years now. I'm coming up on year 3 here. But when I looked into the community, because I've been a follower of the community for probably 5-6 years, and one thing that I constantly saw in repetition was people who were emulating Bond, who is the hero, or in some cases people call him the anti-hero. And I knew that if I was going to take the time, if I was going to put in the energy and get creative with something like this, I needed my own like slice of the pie, if you will.
Mhm.
Some people refer to it as a niche. And I knew that there's cars, there's gadgets, there's girls, there's the hero. Nobody was talking about the villains. And let's just be real for a second. The villains are 100%, 50% of every film.
And a lot of
They're-
people, of course, will say that the villain is the what maybe sets the good James Bond movies apart from the ones that aren't, right? Or aren't as
Correct.
good.
Well, some may argue with that on Moonraker, but you're on the right track. Because I love Hugo Drax. I think he's an awesome villain. The movie, not so much. Just overall, there's but again, yes, I would agree overall. Yes, what you're saying.
Yeah, and as like I said, we were getting ready for you to come on today, and I was thinking about villains and like where does this fit in our How to Bond series? And I was thinking about like in our childhood. I don't know if you guys ever felt this. When I was a kid, and we would be playing, whatever. If it was Army or if it was playing with action figures or playing video games or whatever. And where there was most of the people kind of wanted to be the good guys, the Bond or the Arnold Schwarzenegger or the Chuck Norris or whoever it is. But there were always those kids that they just gravitated to the villain side, right? We always see that. Like, I mean, I thought probably the best example is like Star Wars, right? In Star Wars, when you think of these, kids, that's like their favorite is Darth Vader, and it's like, well, he's a pretty bad guy. Why would we want to go to the villain side? But I'm sure the parents were a little concerned about that. But
they have cookies. I mean, come on, David. They have cookies.
Exactly. but there is kind of a natural, for some, tendency to that. It doesn't even necessarily. I would say it's probably not usually about the villainy, I guess you could say, about the Bond villains, maybe. But there's I think there's other attributes that maybe go into it. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, I think it comes down to is pretty much since day one, even going back to like westerns or even like older Japanese films, the bad guys are just cool. Like they just are. They're usually suave. They're usually powerful. They usually have a lot of money. They have a lot of control and say so in how things go, and they usually dress very very well. And so there's this whole element of like, yes, we see Bond do that. We see the hero do that in some cases, but in a lot of cases, the villain will go to that nth degree because they don't have to be righteous. They don't have to be all holier than thou, if you will. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, they can be greedy and they can show it. They can flaunt it. As to where a hero character really has to kind of dial it back because that would go against, well, I could give that energy or that time to something good. The villain doesn't care. They can just go all in on being whoever they want to be, whatever they want to be, whenever they want to be.
And
No
I think
inhibitions.
and I think that's perfectly said because I think the best villains are going to be like the most memorable villains, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like when you think of Bond, the I think of instantly like Goldfinger. Look how big and exuberant he was, and how obsessed he was with gold, and the
Yeah.
extent that he took to it. I mean, obviously he owned the golf park, and he owned a lot. His whole was it the Rolls Royce was completely made out of gold. Like he went to huge extents just for the sake of gold, even into raiding Fort Knox. It's pretty interesting to see. Obviously, like David was saying, villains have to have really good attributes, which means they have to be really smart. I mean, some of them, even within the novels, had education, a lot of education. It's not like a lot of them kind of just came from nothing. Some of them even came from money, which is interesting because it's kind of contrast from Bond a little bit. But to see that they have the education and to see that they're using what the tools and resources to have to make this elaborate plan, because look at all the villain plans from like even You Only Live Twice to like the
Mhm.
volcano, and like the layer inside of the volcano.
Just watching Doctor No the other night. We're
Mm.
talking about the first film in a 25 film franchise. And Doctor No himself says that the criminal mind must, not is, must always be superior. And that's that intelligence. That's where, and I think that's where a lot of the confidence you see in a lot of these villains comes from because they're not stupid. They
Yeah.
know they're smart. They surround, and it's almost like that phrase of like, God, I'm surrounded by idiots. When you feel that way, when you feel like you're the smartest person in the room, there's an air about someone. There's a confidence about someone, whether or not it's ego driven or something else is driving that force. That says something about that person's character.
I was just gonna say, out of all like those attributes, and the whether it's the intelligent part or the fact that they have been really dedicated to something that they've wanted to control, what out of all of those aspects would you consider to be the perfect ones?
Or maybe essentials, right? The essentials of a Bond villain, right? That's
Yeah,
kind of what we're
like
looking at
things
here.
that make up
Hmm.
Yeah, like what do
the
they have
essential
to
elements.
have? And maybe
Yeah.
sometimes when they fail, right? It's like not the greatest Bond villain in terms of how they play off on public. What attributes or things are essential to making a good Bond villain?
Well, I mean, obviously intelligence, because let's think about it this way: we've seen the brute force Bond villains fall off, die. Blofeld, up until No Time to Die, which elements I don't like to talk about, but no, I mean, when you're the man behind the curtain and you're the one running the show, yeah, you have to be smart because you have to think of every little detail in that plan and you got to put a body in place for that. and you've got to get them to all work on the same page to see that bigger picture, but to focus on the element that you need them to focus on and do their part of that cog, because you need everybody working in that machine to run smoothly. So I would say intelligence is the biggest one, and for me, you see that clearly with Le Chiffre in Casino Royale.
Ah,
He's not super physical. He can get physical, but he didn't toe off against Bond like nose to nose. He had some of his thugs soften him up before he put him in the torture suit.
he had a niche. So, I mean, whether it was attached or not, I don't know. But
down there.
no, but yeah, that is a great point, because I mean, it's funny because a lot of the villains that you see aren't very. I mean, some of my favorite villains go head to head with Bond, and that's kind of something we'll talk about in a bit. But some of them aren't really on that physical level as Bond, but yet they're the main enemy that he has to defeat. So it's that almost the intelligence is absolutely key and necessary in order for them to succeed.
If I'm smart enough, I could hire somebody who's physically capable of beating you up. I'll just do that. Save me from getting into the physical altercation, possibly scarring me up. I'll just hire somebody. That way I don't even deal with you, and I can use my energy and my intelligence and my time better served elsewhere.
Yeah, obviously, I think intelligence. I think you're right on, both of you guys, on this. I think when I was thinking about the kind of different attributes, it kind of shocked me because I didn't think about it that much until we were doing on this podcast. But the idea that so many of the attributes we think of with the villains are the same attributes we, in many ways, think of as Bond. And of course, we talk a lot about it, and that's kind of what I wanted to lead us into, is talking about how kind of this element of the villains being a reflection of Bond, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the attributes are so similar until a slight point where it's like, here's the difference, right?
So I think the big difference between Bond and a villain of any sort, and I've heard some other people say this, so I don't want to absolutely take credit 100% for this answer, but
we steal the best things, right?
of course. But I think, and really you could say this of any hero villain combo, Batman, Robin, or Batman, Joker, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, so on and so forth. But what it boils down to is the world smacks. They smack you down. It beats you down. Maybe that's a better way. The world will beat you down. And the difference between a hero and a villain is how they respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
So a hero will say, okay, I got beat down. I'm going to get back up, and I'm
except
going
in No Time to Die.
Well, yeah, except for No Time to Die. Well, no. I'll make a point on that here in a second.
Okay.
But the world beats you down, and he gets back up, and he says to himself, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this doesn't happen to someone else. That's a hero's mentality. A villain mentality is, I got beat down and I'm going to beat back. I'm not going to prevent this from anybody else. I'm going to hit the world back.
Let's go around the table a little bit about kind of some of our favorite maybe Bond villain moments in terms of just representing that, like how to Bond. Here's a classic example of Bond villain moments. When I think of top Bond villain moments, one of them is GoldenEye. We talk a lot about GoldenEye on this channel because for me that was like that was my first Bond. But the whole ending sequence of GoldenEye on the satellite, where it's literally mano a mano. And my favorite thing about that is that it is physically mano a mano, as you guys kind of mentioned, was like a lot of times in our Bond movies, we get this back and forth of two equals, but often the villain is not equal physically, right? Mm-hmm. And I love that about the end of Goldeneye, that it's physically equal in addition to mentally, emotionally, all those pieces. So that would be one of mine. And I would say for my second one, From Russia with Love, right? In terms of equal, right? Or maybe even more possibly in From Russia with Love, where you really get that. And that's something that I think for me that I like in a Bond villain. We don't often get it. And I think that's actually true for me in villains in most of my, action movies and things that I like. I like a little bit of element of that they can go at each other as well, both mentally but also physically. So those are kind of two I would say of my favorites.
I'm gonna throw a wrench in the whole thing real quick and say, Die Another Day, actually. Now hear me out, hear me out. At the end, when they're in the plane, they're going against each other and they're physically going all out to the point where you get the classic line, face destiny to face gravity, and then he just, throws him into the engine, which is aerodynamically true, but yet the plane would really I won't get into that, the aerodynamics. But anyways, sorry, pilot brain. But no, that I think is pretty iconic, even though that's not a very popular one. And then I like Stromberg and Roger Moore. I mean, you have two pretty suave gentlemen go face to face to each other. But then at the end, it's like the way that he ends it could be some of the most suave death scenes that you could imagine, with Roger just, putting him away while they're really at the end, each end of the tables, which was representative of them being pretty equal, both being at both heads of the table, if you think about it. So those are my two.
Great picks. Yeah, and honestly, for me, who I'm going to cheat a little bit here because it's not necessarily a villain, but it is a type of villain. And David, you touched on this earlier. It is the mirror image. So I'm not going to go GoldenEye here, but it's like Silva or Scaramanga. It
Nice.
is the counter agent, if you will, where they're basically that mirror image, and they did take that turn. So that's, you could go either one with Scaramanga or Silva, and it is the intelligence, but it is also the physicality there.
Yeah.
Similar to Trevelyan.
Yeah.
But still a little different because they went real far. Real far. I mean, Trevelyan, yeah, he had a train, awesome. Scaramanga had an island. Silva had an island. It's like they really went all out. But then, of course, I mean, my number one, you're never going to get me to say there's going to be a better villain than Telly Savalas, and for On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
Maybe one of the greatest villain actors ever, right?
Oh my Lord, what a performance did he give us as Blofeld, because he was so poised. He was so calm, and it just added to the sinister that was Blofeld in that film.
So, Chris, we talked about the kind of a lot of attributes, the intelligence, all these things. So, and we talked a little bit also about kind of what maybe people shouldn't do in terms of the Bond villain. So if people were listening to this podcast and saying what were a couple things that they could put into their daily lives to live their lives better from Bond villains, give us like a couple things that are just like, these would be things that on a daily life process people could take to live more like a Bond villain and maybe have a little better life too.
Always dress better than you think you should. Always. I don't care where you're going. If it's the grocery store, if it's a funeral, if it's a party, dress better than you think you should, because that will give you that much more confidence in any situation. That's probably my number one take. However, if you're really wanting to put like the villain aspect into your life, organization. You can't run a criminal organization, whether it be on a small scale or a massive global scale, if you're unorganized. And so that starts with you, that starts with your week, that starts with your morning. If everything is fly by the seat of your pants to live your life is going to reflect that, and you're going to look like you're flying by the seat of your pants. So that's one thing that villains are very good at, is they're calculated and they're patient.
Both really good things. And the one that comes to me is ambition, right? Like that's the one
Well,
that comes
yeah.
to me. And for me, when I think about Bond villains, often, or any villains, it's almost like their ambition is their undoing, right? They go so far that they let something slip. They're trying to go so far. They're never settled. They're always trying to get more. And that's probably something we could also learn from Bond villains, or from villains as a whole. But yeah, having ambition, right, to want something, to want something greater, hopefully in a good way, but in our world. But that idea of taking that ambition, I think that's something that we can all take away.
Oh, absolutely. And to kind of stack on that, if you don't mind, years ago I used to play in a rock band, and I was the drummer, and I was also the business manager. And my bandmates used to lovingly refer to me as Chris Jong Un, because I was so strict with them. I would actually lie to them about call times and load in times, because I knew that if I told them the real time, they would be late. So I would tell them things like an hour, 2 hours early, and then they would actually show up, and we'd be on time for things.
And that's a good example of a good villain. A good
right,
villain,
exactly.
right?
It's like you
Got to
kind
get
of
stuff
gotta,
done, right?
yeah, start thinking about your people and who you're working with, and manipulate in a positive manner.
Well, thank you, Chris, so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. It's been great talking with you guys. David, it was really nice to meet you for the first time. And obviously, Chris. Me and Chris have some things planned that we can't talk about just yet, but there's some big things coming.
Villain things, right?
Mhm.
Ooh, well, yeah. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this, and then for everybody
Yes.
listening, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of How to Bond on the Those Bond Guys podcast. Until the next time, you guys take care. Everyone be safe, and Merry Christmas, 007.
We'll see you
Ooh.
next time.
Thanks for having me, guys. Take it
Thanks.
easy.
Bye.